Cost of living is the #1 voter concern, and now a public split has emerged between the Reserve Bank and the government over why inflation isn't coming down faster. It's a disagreement over whether governments are spending too much. I'm David Spears. Welcome to Insiders. Parliament is back tomorrow after the winter break. With an election due by May, the clock is ticking and there's a backlog of legislation the government wants passed. Reforms to the NDIS, aged care, political donations, gambling ads, its future Made in Australia plans and more. The main thing voters want is some relief on cost of living. But the Reserve Bank has now made it clear it won't be delivering an interest rate cut anytime soon. The bank says federal and state government spending is pushing up demand in the economy. That hasn't gone down well with the Prime Minister or Treasurer.
No surprises from the RBA today. The cash rate is on hold at 4.35%.
Many people with home loans will be welcoming that. However,
the bank's governor warned inflation is taking longer to get under control.
The longer inflation remains elevated, the more it hurts everyone, all Australians.
Australians are doing it tough enough already. The last thing they needed today was more cost of living pressure.
Did the RBA consider a rate rise at the meeting?
Yes, the board did consider a rate rise at this meeting.
We just think the economy is running a little bit hotter than we thought previously.
You've now got a war between the Albanese government and the Reserve Bank governor.
It is clear that inflation is running the economy, not the government.
The federal government is announcing a multi-billion-dollar plan to give people working in childcare a pay rise.
Unless we do something about wages in this sector, we won't have a workforce. This is a really important commitment that we're making.
This is an investment in a workforce and it is an investment in Australian children.
Is it inflationary?
No, it's not, because what it will do is keep costs down.
Nobody begrudges an increase in the wages of any worker, let alone childcare workers.
But. Peter Dutton is addicted to saying no.
It's not going to be a benefit to the childcare workers if we just see interest rates stay higher for longer under Labor.
We are making sure that costs are kept down so that families will benefit. Good for workers, good for children, good for families, good for our economy, good for Australia. Thank you very much.
My guest this morning is the Director General of ASIO, Mike Burgess, on the decision to lift the terror alert level to probable. First, let's check what's making news. ASIO told the Albanese government in mid-2022 the terror alert level should be lowered, but the government stalled for almost 6 months before enacting the change. The ABC's defence correspondent Andrew Green reports there was lengthy discussion over when it would be appropriate to announce the shift. By contrast, the government acted almost immediately on ASIO's advice when it raised the alert level on Monday. Israel is facing condemnation for an airstrike in Gaza that's estimated to have killed more than 90 people. The strike hit a school where thousands were seeking refuge. The Israeli Defence Force says it was also being used as an active Hamas facility and 19 militants were killed. The US and the UK have expressed concern over the strike. And a new poll shows US Vice President Kamala Harris now leading Donald Trump in 3 key states: Michigan, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. The New York Times Siena College poll suggests a dramatic reversal since Joe Biden's departure from the race. We're going to start with the Reserve Bank and why it's not cutting interest rates anytime soon. It reckons there's still too much heat in the economy, in part due to this one in red: government spending pushing up demand. It's the strongest contributor to growth. And this chart from the Bureau of Statistics tells a similar story. Federal and state government spending came down after the pandemic and then started rising again. Now, the federal government argues its spending is needed to help struggling families and isn't pushing up inflation. But in the lead up to the election, all sides of politics are now on notice. A spendathon won't help. Let's see what the panel makes of it. We're joined this week by David Crowe, Melissa Clarke and John Kehoe. Very good morning to all of you. So look, David, there's no disagreement. Inflation's proving sticky. It needs to come down, but there is this difference over what's contributing to demand in the economy. Who's right, who's wrong?
I think the government is very clearly on the defensive here because it's in black and white in the RBA statement that state and federal spending announcements are a factor here in keeping demand up and therefore being a factor in inflation. Now, this is something that the government has had great difficulty with in confronting in the last few days. But most economists are basically on the side of the RBA here in saying that the government spending is a factor. Now, I think a couple of key points. When the stage 3 tax cuts were rejigged at the beginning of this year, Michelle Bullock said that did not change the inflation outlook for the RBA. So I don't think we can sort of suddenly pin what's happening this week on those stage 3 tax cuts. At the same time, the May budget had $10 billion in new spending over the year. That was the decisions taken by the government that added money to the economy. But again, you've got to put that in the perspective of the entire economy. It's a relatively small amount.
Which is what, about $2.6 trillion?
Yeah.
Is that a lot?
It's not a lot. However, as your chart just showed, the tendency is to add federal money to the economy. I think the states clearly should be taking responsibility here as well.
Because there's certainly in Queensland a lot of spending going on leading up to an election there.
But to get to the core point, I don't think it's accurate to call this a war between the RBA and the federal government. But there is a divergence of their views on the economy. The government clearly has to worry about tanking the economy, and that's a priority there for it. At the same time, the RBA
doesn't want a recession. But
the RBA is a little bit, it's missing. It's not achieving the cut to inflation that it originally forecast. Inflation staying higher for longer, and that's on the RBA, so the conditions are there for a blame game.
Well, let me show you what they're saying. The Treasurer certainly is rejecting any blame for the fact that inflation's going to be remaining too high for even longer now.
That's crystal clear in the language that spending is fueling the persistence of inflation. So Commonwealth spending, including by your government, is fueling inflation.
I don't accept that. I don't agree with that. I don't think that's what the statement says in essence. Or what the forecasts say is that our cost of living policies are helping to push inflation down in the near term, not up.
Yeah, they're pushing the headline inflation rate down, and I'll come to that. But I want to show you the Reserve Bank Governor, Michelle Bullock. She made some comments in Armidale, her hometown, on Thursday as well, which were a bit more nuanced on this.
Governments have a job to do, and I have a job to do. My job and the Reserve Bank's job is to get inflation down. The governments have a different job. Their job is also to get inflation down, and they acknowledge that, but it's also to provide services and infrastructure for the Australian people. And so they need to do that at the same time as they need to focus on keeping inflation down. So my personal view is that they're doing what they can do in that area, and I'm doing what I can do in that area.
Mel, it sounds like she's almost defending government spending there.
I think that's been one of the really interesting things here is that we do have a difference of opinion between the Reserve Bank and the Treasurer of is the economy running hot or not? But they seem to be at pains to not step on each other's toes, to say, no, they're right, but I just see it slightly different. Yeah. It is quite a delicate dance, and it hasn't always been that way in the past, so I think it's notable. But I think Michelle Bullock's point here is a really important one because we have two different institutions with two very different remits. We have a Reserve Bank that has a limited range of tools, as we always discuss, to deal with inflation, and it can look at conditions in the macro. We have a government that has a responsibility to look after the welfare of citizens, and getting inflation down is a key way to do that. But it also has to look at the detail of that, and it will be looking more closely, I think, at things like what are these figures, latest inflation figures showing us about the price of fruit and vegetable, which has gone up a lot in the last June quarter. What's gone up in rentals? These are the sort of level of detail that a government cannot ignore as it looks at the bigger picture as the Reserve Bank.
Yeah, John, how would you characterise this? Is it a war between the Reserve Bank and the government, or something a little more nuanced than that?
Look, I don't think it's a war between Michelle Bullock and Jim Chalmers. They generally get on reasonably well behind the scenes. But it's definitely a split in the economic message and the narrative coming out of the government and the Reserve Bank. And the reason for that, frankly, is because the government's spin on inflation has sort of finally come to roost this week. It's caught up with it. And it's in the Reserve Bank's own statements and numbers, them pointing to a fairly chunky increase in public demand since their May forecasts. Now, that's federal and also, importantly, state government spending as well. But what's happened since May, we've had the federal budget and state budgets. And also, the government for more than a year has been saying they're putting downward pressure on inflation. They're reducing inflation. Well, these numbers seriously call that into doubt.
Well, let's have a look at these numbers, right? Because to get technical here, this is the difference between what's happening at headline inflation and underlying inflation. These are the Reserve Bank's figures this week. Red line is your headline inflation. It does come down. That's largely thanks to things like that energy bill relief, right? But it's only temporary. Next year, when that goes, you can see the red line, headline inflation, goes back up again. The blue line is trimmed mean, or the underlying inflation. This is what the Reserve Bank really focuses on, and you can see it is taking a while to get back to that middle of the target zone where it needs to be.
Yeah, well, this is the thing. I mean, the government's been a bit cute here because it's saying we're putting downward pressure on inflation through the energy rebates. Now, sure, in the short term, that actually, according to the RBA's forecast, by the middle of next year, gets headline measured inflation down to 2.8%. That sounds great, but when that measure expires, inflation's expected to kick back up again to 3.7%. The fundamental thing is you can't subsidise your way out of inflation. Inflation is an imbalance of demand and supply in the economy. The Reserve Bank thinks demand's running too hot. And what's contributing to that high demand in the economy relative to supply? It is, one of the factors is federal and, importantly, state government spending, particularly on the go forward from this point.
Some argue that pushing down the headline inflation rate still helps because a lot of things are pegged to it, whether it's wage increases or government payments and so on. So that is nothing.
And you can, I think the government would no doubt make the case that, as we were discussing before, its remit is to help people in the meantime, and it has to make calculations of, well, will this delay a reduction in inflation? They're never going to concede that they won't. But it's also politically not sustainable to not be seen to be doing anything to assist people with cost of living in the meantime.
That's right.
That's why we have things like the energy.
We've all mentioned the states here. They do deserve a bit of attention when we talk about government spending. And look, a lot of states are doing big infrastructure spends at the moment, and that has the impact that a lot of people are talking about. A lot of construction workers going into those big infrastructure projects, very few available to build homes. But then Queensland, right? There's an election in October. Labor's struggling to hold on to government. Stephen Miles is spending big. He's got $1,000 electricity rebates, $200 school kid vouchers, 50-cent public transport fares, and now get this one, possibly having government-owned petrol stations.
Where we are unable to identify interest from an independent retailer in building a service station on that land, then we will trial building 12 publicly owned petrol stations on those sites.
And John, why hasn't anyone thought of this before? A government-owned petrol station?
Well, they're also talking about price caps on petrol as well. Right. And I wonder where they got the idea from price caps after the federal government had coal and gas price caps imposed. I mean, this is the problem when you don't hit silly policy ideas on the head. Other people get silly ideas. And it was interesting to see Jim Chalmers' response this week because he said it's good to see Queensland thinking outside the square. Now, I would have thought a federal treasurer, I know it's difficult because it's the Labor Party, it's in Queensland, his home state, they're facing an election.
He doesn't want to bag them.
It's a sort of a soft endorsement of it. He should be hitting this stuff on the head.
I thought he was pretty careful in his language, and then maybe you're right. Maybe he could have.
I think the Feds
a bit stronger, but
the Feds see that policy for what it is. It's naked populism. It's bad policy.
But they're not saying that.
But they're not saying it because there's a Queensland state election, and then they'll get blamed for torpedoing Stephen Miles before the state election. And the politics are difficult. But John's right. There should be a better debate in Australia where bad policy ideas get called out, because this is an example of a bad policy idea. Are we going to get subsidised snack food at the petrol station?
Do they sell tobacco?
The governments have got to be careful about where they go with public
money. What about government-owned supermarkets?
We do need to lift the level of debate. I mean, the only sort of institution that's really standing up at the moment is the Productivity Commission with some pretty frank assessments. We're not getting a very healthy economic policy debate in this country.
And look, point two is in Queensland, all of these cost of living spending measures that he's announced, they're not really shifting the needle for Labor much.
Well, no, I don't think it's necessarily going to have the desired effect, and whether it actually turns into a policy that's implemented, I think, is probably another question as well. But when it comes to not being able to have a good policy debate, part of the problem is that we have both currently with the coalition in opposition, but also when Labor was last in opposition as well, a political lean towards small target. They don't want to put out alternative ideas. They don't want to thrash out the details because it leads to questions about, well, what would you do? And no one wants to cough up an answer on that.
It's a good point. Does Peter Dutton, does the federal opposition have any clear solutions on cost of living and inflation?
Angus Taylor says that one thing that they would not do is spend $45 billion, right? And so there are federal policies that the coalition has opposed that add up to about that much money.
But has that money gone out the door?
No, that's the National Reconstruction Fund, it's the Future Made in Australia, it's the Housing Australia Future Fund.
That stuff's still to be spent.
Hardly any of that has actually hit the real economy, so you can't blame that money for what's happening with inflation at the moment. And so there's really no coherent answer from the coalition on what they would do differently on inflation. At the same time, Peter Dutton promised earlier this year that there would be a new coalition plan on the stage 3 tax cuts so that they would go further on tax reform.
Well, not only that,
they are very constrained now in what they can do.
He still wants to give tax cuts to higher income earners, and he also on Friday started talking about zonal tax. So
where's that idea going? There's a division on that
as well. Tax cuts, whether it's for the regions or high income earners, is that going to help inflation?
No, it's not. I mean, they will have to come up with serious spending cuts if they want to have more tax cuts as well. And a lot of the sort of savings that you were talking about with Angus Taylor, that's in the medium term. That's not a here and now sort of thing to reduce inflation. I think we probably do need to see some more serious policies from the coalition. They're just talking about reducing the size of government, reducing spending, but we probably need to see more specifics from them in the lead up to the election.
The government really is looking at an outlook that is no significant change to interest rates between now and the election. You don't have an early election scenario now with some kind of rate cut. And maybe if they're lucky, there'll be a rate cut next year, but they shouldn't be counting on it. At the same time, that means a tight MYEFO budget update at the end of this year. And they could get slammed if there's a spend-a-thon in an election budget next year. And at the same time, the coalition's got to be extremely careful with whatever policies
puts
they
the handcuffs
work up.
on both sides.
Exactly.
Yeah, it does. All right, I want to come back to some of this. We're now going to shift, though, to the increased terror alert level and speak to ASIO boss Mike Burgess. The heightened threat of terrorism is being driven by a complicated mix of racism, radical religious ideology and angry young men. In the UK, some of the worst unrest in a decade has been unfolding on the streets. Violent riots broke out after the fatal stabbing of 3 young girls. Misinformation spread online, wrongly suggesting the attacker was a Muslim asylum seeker. The British Home Secretary says social media has also fanned the flames.
We've seen with the social media has been used to really organise some of the violence, to inflame the tensions, some of the racial hatred being inflamed online, and we will continue to pursue those prosecutions.
Mike Burgess, thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
Are those riots we're seeing in the UK or have seen there, is that the sort of thing you're worried about happening here in Australia?
Yeah, deeply concerning what we're seeing in the United Kingdom at this point in time. Do I think we could see that at the scale that we're seeing in the United Kingdom? Probably not. The drivers, though, that driving that activity in the United Kingdom are similar to the drivers that have resulted in us raising the national terrorism threat level here in Australia.
And just explain to us what they are, because as I mentioned, it's quite a complicated mix of drivers, as you call them.
Yeah, so we last raised the threat level to probable in 2014. That's when we had a strong ideology, charismatic individuals that were driving people to travel overseas and fight for the caliphate and conduct acts of terror on shore. Today it's completely different. We have a broad range of ideologies, people radicalising more quickly and more people thinking violence is permissible. Social, economic grievances, conspiracy theories are also in the mix, along with traditional religiously motivated Islamist violent extremism and nationalist and racist violent extremism.
So are you saying that Islamist extremism is no longer the biggest threat? Is it on a par with some of the politically motivated violence?
The key message here is there's a broad range of ideologies. Religiously motivated violent extremism is a caseload for ASIO that we look at. Religiously motivated is still the principal or dominant force in our caseload, but it's not the only one. And the reason why we've raised the threat level this time is because we're seeing more ideologies, more people being radicalised quickly, and more people thinking violence is the answer.
What can be done about this?
Well, this requires a whole of society approach, but let me speak about my agency and law enforcement. We will be looking through our caseload to where we've assessed people to have a hateful, violent ideology, but think they won't conduct an act of terror. We're now reviewing that because there's more permission in society. Of course, more broadly though, the youth are vulnerable and minors in particular. In the last, since April, we've had 8 instances we and the police have investigated for either acts of terrorism, planned acts of terrorism or alleged acts of terrorism. 5 of those incidents had minors involved, the youngest was 14. There's something that we have to focus on there across society, mums, dads, community leaders, state governments, federal government. We've got to press into that. The media has to be careful about their headlines. It can inflame. Politicians have to be careful about their robust political debate, and I'm not suggesting that's not appropriate. It's got to continue. I've got to watch my words. So when I said to you before, Islamic violent extremists, let me be very clear, I'm not talking about people of the Islamic faith. The vast majority of them are not violent extremists and not the problem, despite where other commentators might want to make them the problem. They're not. There's a small number of people in society with a broad range of ideologies that think violence is the answer. That must be a focus.
Can I just pick you up on politicians need to watch their language? You've said this a few times. Do you think they are?
I will not comment on public about their language. What I can say, having said I won't comment, let me comment. I don't think most of them actually deliberately seem to use inflamed language that will generate tension and potential violence. I don't believe for the most of them that's their intent. I'm just suggesting we all need to watch our language because there is a direct connection between inflamed language, inflamed tension and violence. That's the reason I put that note out after the 7th of October attacks. Sadly, we're seeing that play out in our society.
Well, Barnaby Joyce was criticised for using the language around bullets and magazines. He apologised after it. Is that the sort of thing you're talking about?
It's unhelpful if you're kind of using analogies or weapons that are designed to hurt people, of course. The Iranian ambassador to Australia, what a classic, great, terrible example of actually inappropriate, unacceptable language that can actually drive violence in our society.
Does that really have an impact, those sort of words from the Iranian ambassador?
Absolutely, and you know, I don't normally comment on diplomats and what they say, but actually that one was an example that was worthy of being called out.
Do there need to be consequences for that?
Again, I'm going to leave that to government in terms of consequences of when diplomats say things that they want to say.
What about the Greens? The Prime Minister often points to them and their references to Labor being complicit in genocide and the protests and so on outside MPs' offices. Is that a problem?
My message is for everyone in the language they use. I get robust political debate. That's got to continue. It's a strong part of society, but just be careful of your language because, again, flame language and flame tension leads to violence.
Is this robust political debate or does it go beyond that?
Well, when it goes beyond that, I think that is a problem for our society. Remember, the most likely terrorist attack in this country right now is an individual that will go to violence with little or no warning and actually little or no planning. It could just be a reaction to language they've heard used from someone, including a politician.
What about social media platforms? Are they doing enough to monitor the content on their platforms to ensure it's not fanning the flames?
So there's no doubt social media has great benefits to society, and there's no doubt the internet, the connectivity that social media sits on is great. The trouble with the internet is it's the greatest incubator of violent extremism, and social media, and the downside, is the greatest accelerator of violent extremism. The algorithms companies use to direct content. A youth only has to search something once, and then in their search feed, they get plenty of violent extremism or extreme material, which is unhelpful and hurtful for their young forming brains.
And are the owners of some of these platforms like Elon Musk making your job harder?
Social media does make our job harder. I think they do need to press in hard into working on those algorithms that feed the misinformation. But it's also, it's not just for them, it's actually for everyone. Users of social media, parents, caregivers, politicians, the media. We just all have to be careful. Use it for the upsides, but be careful of the downsides. I think minors in particular, though, need the biggest help from community, from governments and from the big tech.
And what about from a parent's point of view? Should people be keeping their kids off social media in your view?
I'd let parents make their own decisions. I think it's important that parents know what their kids are looking at. Of course, that can be really hard. During COVID, 50% of our CT caseload were minors. That's probably because they were locked in their bedrooms, on their devices, unregulated by schoolyard activity, family outings. Got to pay attention to what your kids are looking at.
You mentioned politicians. I'm wondering about the threat they face. And you've spoken about this in the past. What's the threat level like at the moment facing politicians in Australia?
Sure. So we've raised the national terrorism threat level, but in part because politically motivated violence now joins espionage and foreign interference as our principal security concern. And politically motivated violence is just that. It's a threatening, intimidating or violent act against a political institution, an individual or a politician. We're certainly seeing more hateful commentary going the way of politicians. More threats are up if you talk to the federal police. Again, that's deeply concerning, and that's a kind of illustration of there's more temperature in our security environment and inappropriate behaviour that's being normalised.
Are you worried about the federal election being a flashpoint?
It's a big matter where you'll have robust political debate, social issues play out. So yes, it'll kind of be a focal point. Is it the main driver? Perhaps not, but it's one that we'll be keeping an open eye on.
The war in Gaza, you've said it's not the cause of this rising anger, but it is a significant driver. What does that mean?
Well, so it's not the direct cause. You remember after the 7th of October, we did not raise the national terrorism threat level. Of course, the cohort that we and the police were looking at, violent extremists, were talking about it and communicating with each other about it, but none of them advocated or conducted an act of terror. And since April, those 8 incidents that we've looked at, none of them were inspired by Gaza. So Gaza itself is not the root cause or singular cause of raising the threat level, but Gaza has driven division in our society. It's a highly emotive issue. The attacks were terrible. The military response is resulting in the death of innocent lives. You can see how it drives strong reactions. Some of those reactions, small number of people, it goes into the wrong direction. Gaza itself, though, is not the sole cause.
But we are seeing a rise in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Is one on the rise more than the other?
So we see both. Of course, there's no doubt, after the 7th of October, there was far more anti-Semitism in this country than Islamophobia, but we have both today. And I don't think it should be considered a race of which one's more important, because they're both harmful, threatening, intimidating and terrible for the people on the receiving end of it, and both are unacceptable.
I want to ask you about the 1,300 or so Palestinians who fled Gaza to come here to Australia on temporary visas. The opposition's expressed some concern here. Do they pose a security threat?
So for all immigration, including when you're balancing humanitarian needs, security checks are critically important. There are processes in place, and I can assure your audience that when things get referred to ASIO, we deal with them effectively. Of course, there might be times when they didn't get referred to us in time. Once we become aware of them, we're able to do the assessments and deal with them effectively.
Well, the opposition's been quite explicit they should be subjected to biometric testing. Should they?
So biometric testing is so we know who you are and we can look you up in a database. That can be part of the process, is effective as long as that identity is in a database somewhere, so it's not the only thing you need to do.
And is that the issue here, they're not in a database?
Well, if they're not in the database, then the biometric testing gives you nothing other than a biometric tag that you can use at a later stage. Critical point is there are security checks, there are criteria by which people are referred to my service for a review, and when they are, we deal with that effectively.
And so they've been subjected to the normal testing, is that right?
People come into this country, there's a visa process in place, and they've gone through that visa process.
Yeah.
Correct.
Sorry, those from Gaza who've come here have gone through the very standard checks.
They've gone through a visa. If they've been issued a visa, they've gone through the process. Part of that visa process is where criteria hit. Right. They're referred to my organisation, and ASIO does its thing.
If they've expressed any support or sympathy for Hamas, is that a problem?
Depends on the what that looks like. If they're supportive because they want their homeland, if they're giving financial support or material aid, that can be a problem, and obviously we take each case on its merits in the context of the information we have before us.
But if it's just rhetorical support?
If it's just rhetorical support and they don't have an ideology or support for a violent extremism ideology, then that's not a problem. If they have a support for that ideology, that will be a problem.
Look, I want to ask you about that story I mentioned from Andrew Green earlier. Was there a delay between when you recommended lowering the terror alert level in 2022 and when the government agreed to do it?
I don't think I want to talk about the internal government process other than to point out within a day of formally briefing the Prime Minister, the national terrorism threat level was raised. One day.
So this week, or the last week, it was one day?
After briefing the Prime Minister for the first time in detail, one day it was announced to public. That was a raising of threat level. What that story is talking about is the lowering of threat level, and I think you'd appreciate there's a big difference in terms of the speed at which you need to communicate that. Now, foreign interference, you mentioned that still remains up there as one of your principal security concerns. I think you referred to Iran in particular. What have they been up to? So, foreign interference, espionage and PMV are our principal security concerns. Foreign interference comes at us in interference in our political system, local, state, federal, and interference in diaspora communities. In diaspora communities, there are multiple countries that attempt to threaten and intimidate Australians living in this country. Iran is one of them that we've caught doing that, and when we catch doing with that, that gets dealt with effectively. Is India another country that's done that? There are a range of countries that will do it, not just Iran. Many countries that would surprise your viewers. When we find it, we deal with it effectively.
Why can you name Iran and not others?
Because Minister O'Neill mentioned Iran publicly. Generally, I'm not in the business of actually giving a whole range of countries other than to tell your audience there's more than one country.
There's a new Home Affairs Minister now. Should Tony Burke be naming more countries?
Well, that's a matter for the new Minister, not me.
Is it, well, politically and diplomatically easier to have a go at Iran, but perhaps more sensitive when it comes to countries we deal with?
Again, I'll leave those judgments to ministers. And that's not to rule out, David, that from time to time I might actually call out certain countries, because I think as Director General of Security I have an important role into explaining the threats to the people we protect, and that may well include calling out certain countries at certain times. But generally that's a matter that I leave for government.
But there's a range of countries. By that do you mean half a dozen?
I can think of at least 3 or 4 that we've actually actively found involved in foreign interference in Australian diaspora communities.
And some of them would surprise us.
Some of them would surprise you. Some of them are also our friends.
Well, that's intriguing. We'll leave us hanging on that one. Look, I want to ask you too. ASIO's been moved from Home Affairs back to the Attorney General's department. The Prime Minister said you welcomed the move. Why?
Well, really where ASIO sits is a matter for government. We're the same organisation we were before when I was working for the Minister for Home Affairs. Our functions are defined in law. Of course, in this threat environment, I think it's absolutely important that we're close to the Australian Federal Police, and that's why I welcome the change.
Your Minister is, well, your direct Minister is now the Attorney General, but the Home Affairs Minister retains responsibility for national security. So how does that work? You answer to one, but there's responsibility across both.
So I'm accountable to the Attorney General. The Attorney General also authorises the warrants of my organisation, most intrusive activities. But of course, the Minister for Home Affairs maintains responsibility for national security and national security policy. And I have frequent conversations with the new Minister on those matters.
Okay, but the situation now, the arrangement works well for ASIO?
It works well for me, but it's not about us. It's actually what works for the government and the Prime Minister.
Mike Burgess, we do appreciate you joining us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, coming up, we're going to look at what the government is hoping to achieve when Parliament returns tomorrow and what it's likely to achieve when Parliament returns this week. First, let's continue this conversation and back to our panel, David Crowe, Melissa Clarke and John Kehoe. Just want to pick up on what we were just discussing there, David, lifting the terror alert level. We find out it happened very quickly, one day after the advice it was announced, and there doesn't seem to be any argument really over the need to do this when you see what's happening here, but what's happening overseas as well.
Yeah, and we saw in Sydney, in Western Sydney, the attack on the bishop in the Western Sydney church. But globally, I think we've had instances like the cancellation of the Taylor Swift concerts in Austria. We've got the riots in England. We've had an attempted assassination of a presidential candidate in the United States. All these things highlight, I guess, the potential for danger and conflict. Social media, I think, is a really interesting aspect of this. I've been very interested in the people who are now coming before the courts in the UK because they were at home playing bingo with families, saw on social media that there was a riot on and then went out to join the riot. And then now in jail, there's a woman who was spreading false information about the alleged killer of children in northern England, and she's been arrested for spreading information that fuels racial hatred. So this kind of thing is happening more widely in society. I think what Mike Burgess is talking about highlights the government's got to move this year on hate speech law. I mean, it's said that it's going to pass hate speech laws in federal parliament. We haven't seen those laws yet, but we're getting to a point where we're going to need those laws.
Yeah, we're seeing them used pretty heavily in the UK, or similar laws being used heavily in the UK. Just on Iran, Mel, it's interesting, the ASIO boss and indeed the government really having a go at the Iranian ambassador over that tweet and also over foreign interference from Iran as well, but a bit more reluctant to call out others who are doing this.
Yeah, and I think he's also making the point that he's content to let the government deal with, having called it out, them to decide how to deal with the circumstances. And we know Penny Wong had the ambassador called in for a rebuke over that tweet with inappropriate language in reference to Israel. But I think it does show the sense at which everyone is reacting to each other, and that comes at a political level, it comes at an institutional level, as we see from ASIO, but it comes at a community level level as well. And we have arrived at a point, particularly with the conflict in the Middle East, where people are willingly and readily challenging each other in public in a way that we haven't necessarily seen on a large scale since perhaps the COVID protests. And the extent of which there's been some extreme activity, I think it's really interesting that Mike Burgess was also talking about permissibility of what is being seen as normalised or allowed when it comes to violent actions, the extremes of the protests that don't represent the majority, but that nonetheless are happening and are happening regularly. And I think that is what is concerning them, just to bring us off Iran and back to domestics.
No, indeed. Well, let's come back to government spending, and in particular the big announcement from the Prime Minister during the week on childcare workers' pay. A 15% pay rise staggered over 2 years, 10% year one, 5% the second year. All up $3.6 billion. It's going to cost taxpayers. John, is this now the norm in the care sector, do you think, where the government is going to have to top up salaries?
Well, it's certainly becoming the norm, David. A $3.6 billion down payment for this 15% pay increase for these workers, but we've already seen it in the aged care sector. The government chipped in, I think it was $14 billion about 18 months ago too for pay increases there. And we now see that there's disability care workers who want the same pay increases as the aged care and childcare workers. No one is begrudging these underpaid workers the pay rises they're getting, but it does raise a couple of fundamental questions. Where is the money coming from to pay for all this? Most of it is just being embedded with new structural spending in the budget. There's no explicit tax increases to pay for it. There's no explicit cost savings to pay for it. It's just being put on the national credit card. And it does sort of raise questions about this expansion of these care sectors when, frankly, we haven't got the NDIS under control. We're looking to expand spending in these other areas before we've actually fixed the NDIS as well.
The government argues that if you don't have enough childcare workers, if they're leaving to get higher paying jobs elsewhere, that's going to affect productivity across the economy.
And it does. I think that is a reasonable argument, and I think it also gives us a hint to where the government is going in the future, which is a broader change to childcare, and maybe we'll see that as part of a pitch for a second term for an Albanese government. It's something they've continued to return to because it does have huge economic benefits if you can have predominantly more women being able to come back to work sooner or take more hours as they come. But you're not going to be able to have some kind of promise of universally available childcare at affordable rates if you don't have a workforce to do that. So it does feel like this is a down payment ahead of a broader change.
Yeah, there's also inevitably the question after what we were discussing earlier, the inflation issue this week about whether more money in people's pockets, a pay rise of this nature, 10% and then a further 5% is going to be inflationary. I put this to Lucy Ellis, who's a former Assistant Governor of the Reserve Bank, now Chief Economist at Westpac. Here's what she said.
It's not enough to sort of really move the dial on their forecast, but the Reserve Bank does seem to be in a bit of a mindset at the moment that every single extra dollar of demand is a problem, and that's because they are so pessimistic about supply capacity.
And you can catch that full podcast interview there with the QR codes for the ABC Listen app or ABC iView. David, probably only at the margins when we talk about inflation, but
the timing was interesting, wasn't it? Because the Reserve Bank had said, watch out for government spending. The next day, the Feds are putting $3.6 billion into wage subsidies in childcare. They didn't want to announce that before the RBA decision, right? They made sure they weren't putting $3.6 billion on the table before the RBA move on interest rates. But it happened fairly soon afterwards, and it does leave them exposed on this spending question. They wanted to be able to talk about this childcare move for a couple of days before Parliament resumes in the week ahead. I can get the politics there, but I think they're now in no doubt Anthony Albanese as Prime Minister wants childcare to be one of the iconic reforms and one of the major second-term agenda items for him.
Well, I mean,
there's no doubt
there's public support, right, for childcare workers do an incredible job. They get paid peanuts. That's a well-known sort of, everyone accepts that. But, as you say, that money coming from the taxpayer is the solution.
Yeah, and the wage subsidy lasts for 2 years. Then the childcare operators have got to pick up a higher wage for their workers under Fair Work rules, which are, expected. That's what the government seems to be planning there. But then that would in turn require greater federal support for the childcare sector. So you end up with a greater subsidy. surely there's got to be a structural answer in that industry.
Well, maybe this is coming. Maybe this is coming because the Prime Minister, as you mentioned, Mel, we're all expecting when they release the full final Productivity Commission report, will announce a pre-election, bigger childcare plan. He's hinting at it.
We're looking at the move towards universal provision of affordable childcare, which is what I said before the election. You do that in stages. A precondition for a successful sector is paying workers a decent wage.
So the first stage was higher subsidies for families, second stage now this pay. The third stage is to come. A universal provision of childcare. What does that look like?
Look, I mean, there's been references to a Canadian system where you can effectively have a highly subsidised model and get $10 a day access, but it is predominantly a government-funded scheme, and you will run into problems of, well, how much is that going to cost? Where does the money coming from? But the flip side to that is, as much as these are structural challenges that need to be dealt with, how long have we also sat here and said, look, the problem is we have a productivity problem in the nation. We haven't been able to move the dial on productivity. That's a long-term thing that needs to happen. One of the ways that you can do that is by improving childcare. So there are a lot of short-term difficulties in doing it, and there are probably going to need to be some really hard questions about the tax mix. Yeah. But if you want to tackle some long-term issues, sometimes you just need to start having these difficult questions.
The challenge is you pump more demand into it, either through the wages or the subsidies. All the evidence shows, and Ben Phillips from the Australian National University has done some excellent research around this, it ultimately leads to higher prices. So the government's going to have a plan. If they're going to pump more money into it, they somehow need to expand the supply of childcare centres and places. That's critical. I mean, this goes to what the Reserve Bank's talking about, because demand is bumping up against supply.
I think that the other flip side of that is also, what do they do about the price pressures? Because greater federal subsidies would logically lead to greater federal regulation as well. And that's something that childcare operators may not want if their prices started coming under greater regulation.
Which we're seeing in this first stage, as you mentioned, with what we're rolling out. One of the conditions of this is that there is I think it's a 4.4% cap on
but only for 12 months, Mel.
Only for 12 months, but I think there's still a lot more to come that we just haven't got yet.
But why would it not be extended? So that's something to watch for if they look at structural change.
Maybe it is something around the locations, and remember Kim Beazley's old idea of ending the double drop-off by having them located at primary schools.
Yeah, Phil Curry reminded us of that on his Friday column. But it's a fair point. I mean, there was a different approach being looked at more than a decade ago, and now we've got this privatised system. We've got privatised, federally controlled system at the childcare stage, then a public system, state-run in the primary school stage and secondary school stage, then universities are back to the feds again.
Yeah.
That whole sort of movement needs.
Anyway, we'll hear more on this before the election this week. Parliament's back tomorrow after the winter break, and there is quite a to-do list. The CFMEU legislation will be first out of the blocks. The union didn't exactly welcome with open arms the idea of sending independent administrators in to clean up the show. So Murray Watt, the new minister in charge, is talking tough about passing a law to make it happen.
The construction division of the CFMEU has clearly failed to operate effectively or in the best interests of its members. Urgent action is required, and it is required now.
So will this be supported in the Parliament? Is that clear? The numbers there to
I think so.
Pass this? You reckon it'll happen?
Murray Watt's been talking to folks about building the support in the Senate for this. I think it would be unlikely that the coalition would oppose a measure that tried to clean up the CFMEU, given their language about the CFMEU, but there will, of course, be argy-bargy about
they will take every opportunity as Parliament sits and as they debate this in the Senate to try and add on all sorts of amendments.
But stopping a practical measure to actually clean up the CFMEU, I think, would be a big call for the coalition. I'm very interested to see where the Greens go on this, because they haven't indicated a position. I think there were some early stage discussions with Labor. But there will be a question over where people line up on this bill.
There's a few other things this week to watch. The NDIS legislation will be introduced tomorrow in the Senate, I understand. Now, this goes to a few things, the rules around entry to the scheme, what money can be spent on, and there's still a bit of negotiating with the coalition around things like using NDIS money for sex workers and so on. And then the registration of providers, so that maybe not all but most will have to be registered providers. This is all about trying to rein in the growth costs of the NDIS, so that's one to watch. The Future Made in Australia legislation is not going to come up in the next couple of weeks, John, but Where's this one up to now, the legislation for the government's big Future Made in Australia plan?
Yeah, it's been interesting, hasn't it? I mean, I think Peter Dutton was asked about it in Western Australia this week, about the critical mineral subsidies, or the tax production credits rather, and he didn't entirely rule it out like Angus Taylor has.
Well, I'll show you this because people might remember in his budget reply, Peter Dutton was calling these tax offset, what are they, tax production credits for critical minerals and hydrogen as corporate welfare for billionaires. They quite like it though in WA. As you mentioned, and when he was over there, he did soften his line.
There are some who are in favour, some who are against, and some who advocate for a better way for support and assistance to be provided. In the end, we've got finite tax dollars, so we'll have all of those discussions. We'll have more to say about ways in which I think we can provide support to some of the sectors.
Yeah, what does that mean?
I think what he's getting at there, I think he was speaking to a bunch of WA miners there in the exploration sector who are in favour of this. So he didn't want to completely poo-poo it in that audience. Obviously,
he's not saying two things out of different sides.
No, but I think what he's probably getting at is the coalition's going to have other policies that they're going to like industrial relations, like environmental protection, a more friendly regulatory environment to get projects up and running. I think they're still going to decline to support these production tax credits for critical minerals, but Peter Dutton wasn't as explicit as he could have been.
He might have to go back and tell them that directly. But how's the whole plan looking for the government here? Because since its announcement on this, we've seen problems for lithium producers, hydrogen as well. How's it stacking up? You're not a particular fan from what I've read.
Front. I mean, I wrote this week that it's running off the rails, and you're seeing they're going to subsidise critical minerals like nickel and lithium. And what's happening in Western Australia at the moment? Nickel and lithium mines are being closed because the global price of those has crashed, yet the government wants to put money into those sectors that are uneconomic and are not commercially viable at the moment. So there's some huge question marks around this. The other thing
And why are they crashing? Because global supply.
Because there's a global oversupply, including Indonesia for some of these commodities with Chinese investment. I mean, the other thing is that Treasury sort of set up this national interest framework to try and keep some guardrails on this thing. And they basically said it's not a good idea to subsidise solar panels or batteries, but what's the government doing? They're pouring a few billion into that. And nobody's really enforcing this framework, not the Treasurer, not Treasury. So I'm not sure it's worth the paper it's written on.
Can I add some disagreement into the conversation? I mean, I think John's absolutely right on some of those critical minerals because there's federal money, taxpayer money going into projects in critical minerals where we keep getting told this is the future. So why aren't private investors going into that? If it's such a great industry, why aren't they going in there?
They're not meant to get the credit until it is a going concern.
Yeah, I guess, so the structure's okay there. But I think also it's worth pointing out on things like hydrogen. Future Made in Australia offers some money for hydrogen. Hydrogen has to be explored as a possible way to generate or produce cleaner energy for the future. So as a federal policy, it makes sense to explore it. I'm not saying spend $30 billion on it. There's a couple of $1 billion in the policy to explore whether that can work, to offer some subsidies to get it up and running, and that seems to me to be worth the
And what about the solar panel one? The company that's already
more questionable
money to make solar panels here.
It's hard to compete with China on the manufacture. But that highlights the geopolitical aspect of this entire policy, which is to reduce the reliance on China for renewables, for critical minerals, for everything.
That's where you have the economic position push up against the national security question. And I think a lot of the analysis has been on the economic side, and particularly some of the good work the Productivity Commission has done looking at precisely these sorts of things. The national security question one, though, is one that falls a bit outside of those economic parameters.
Two other reform areas where the government really would dearly love to have bipartisanship on before it brings anything to Parliament: aged care, and that seems to be still stuck in a bit of a holding pattern, but political donations too. And I know, David, you've been writing about this one. That's been pushed back a little bit. Are we going to get changes to give us more transparency around political donations before the election?
I think we are, but I don't think they don't take effect before the election.
Right.
They would take until the next parliamentary cycle to actually come in, so they won't change
the rules.
So
Clive Palmer can still spend a tonne at the coming election?
He can. I think that's going to be the upshot unless there's a major change to the plan in federal parliament. But what we don't know is the detail. We expect Don Farrell, the Special Minister of State, to start some consultations with fellow members of Parliament in the week ahead when they're all back in Canberra to then explore that, but we won't see the draft bill for a couple more weeks.
I think there is still a lot of disagreement about what the priorities should be and what those details should be, because what might suit the two major parties here in terms of, you might well be agreement when it comes to, say, greater transparency and quicker real-time disclosure. But if they also want to look at things like caps within seats, then that's going to have a big deal of concern on the crossbench that have certainly benefited from smaller numbers of larger donors. So getting agreement that is going to work through the Senate is taking all of Don Farrell's negotiating skills to land.
It's going to be a busy, few weeks, few months ahead, no doubt about it. All right, our panel, John Kehoe, Mel Clarke and David Crowe, will be back very shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Burgess and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with writer and broadcaster, the one and only Benjamin Law, and a very warm welcome, mate.
G'day, Mike. Good to be here.
The RBA captured the nation's interest this week but didn't end up raising them, and David Rowe has beautifully, in the way that only David Rowe can, captured this.
First of all, the roller coaster ride, where are interest rates going to land? Well, you're probably going to end up in the same place.
Rates roller coaster. Come on, Michelle, live a little. And I think she's trying to apply the brakes here with the percentage sign.
Yeah, look what's coming up behind her as well. The riots in the UK, discontent in Germany.
And at the front here is a bear market, I think.
Oh, that's what the bear was.
Kamala Harris and a very fleshy Donald Trump.
I mean, David Rowe really has that way of drawing people.
He does flesh.
You can't unsee that, can you?
No. Benjamin, thank goodness for Nina Kennedy and giving all the cartoonists a visual metaphor.
She's giving us so much. I mean, the first ever gold medalist in the pole vault for Australia, but also material and metaphor.
A lovely Andrew Dyson cartoon. Albo here's having a good old attempt to get over the interest rate, which hasn't dropped. Unfortunately, it's going to be a harder landing than he thought.
He's not really drawn as an athlete there either, is he?
No. Dean Alston has also picked up on the pole vault, and he's got Jim Chalmers, who seems to have skewered himself here.
He's got a rising tent, but in a way that he doesn't want to have.
Yeah, Fiscal Olympics, the inflation pole vault. I'm not quite sure where Michelle Bullock's aiming her pole.
Yeah, but there looks to be implied violence here, and a little bit of glee too.
Beautiful David Pope cartoon, who's got the family here balancing on the house and the shopping trolley and a backflip and trying to raise the kid up. And any tips, says Albo to Nina Kennedy.
It's a lot of acrobatics to keep a household afloat, and looking to Albo for help. Not sure that he's giving it to them.
Benjamin, the RBA may not have raised the interest rates, but the AFP raised the threat rate.
It's always difficult to know when that happens, how we're supposed to respond. What do we do with that information?
Matt Golding has an idea of where this should land. Do you remember back to the fridge magnet, be alert, not alarmed?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Stick it on there, and just to remind yourself as you have a cup of tea to remain clenched.
Yeah. Threat level, low, moderate, high, fridge
magnet.
Well, Ben, it turns out that the ban on gambling wasn't something we could bet on. Beautiful Alan Moyer cartoon, 5-1, there's a gambling ad within 2 minutes. That's a sure bet.
Yeah, I think we could probably safely bet on that ourselves, Mike.
The Glen Lever, this is down in Timid Town, and Anthony Albanese is running through the streets here with guts, courage, spines, wrong part of town.
Oh, for such a cute cartoon, it's quite brutal, isn't it? And he's so small as well, so the feeling that it engenders is pity, which is not the feeling that you want directed at you as a Prime Minister necessarily.
Ben, if you're sick of bad sports and politics, there's always the Olympic Games, and hasn't it been just a joy to watch?
You know what I love feeling more than feeling correct? It's feeling smug. And when we know that per capita we've won more medals than any other Olympics that we've competed in, I think it's worth feeling smug. That's a good feeling to carry through.
Mark Knight seems to think the Eiffel is but a trifle of what it used to be. When we decided to put a small piece of the Eiffel Tower into each Olympic medal, how were we to know the Australians would win so many?
We love talking about punching above our weight, and now that we've got the statistical proof to actually show it, I mean, I feel like we're going to win, like, I don't know, gold in Nintendo Switch soon or something really obscure.
John Kehoe has a lovely cartoon. Let me explain to you all what Makarrata means. It means coming together after a struggle, so let's all come together for a good old chinwag. Chew the fat, pat each other on the back, sign an NDA or two, and sit around a campfire sharing war stories about the campaign and where we'd like our reconciliation journey to go next in an entirely non-binding fashion. Ooh. The really hard part of this is watching the sun go down behind Uluru here.
Yeah, time is running out. I think this cartoon really encapsulates that in quite a poignant and brutal way.
Yeah. Benjamin, it's been a great pleasure unpicking events this week. I'll let you do the honours.
Back to you, Spearsy.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. Thank you, Mike. Time for some final observations. A quick one from me. Remember the Optus and Medibank cyber or data breaches? And there was a lot of discussion at the time around why do so many private companies have to store so much of our private information? Bill Shorten, he's the Government Services Minister, he'll be announcing this coming week a bit of a breakthrough on this. They've done a lot of work on it, and it'll be a MyGov secure data exchange. Companies can go to it, verify that you, David Crowe, are who you say you are, without the company having to hold all of your data. That's the idea, and they'll also you'll be able to access your MyGov information account with facial ID rather than a password or PIN number as well. So that's to come. John.
Thanks, David. Look, the Australian Financial Review's longest-serving editor-in-chief, Michael Stutchbury, has just stood down from the role after 13 years. During that time, he's seen off 6 prime ministers, 6 treasurers. He's had enormous impact on the political and economic debate in this country, dating all the way back to the 1980s and the Hawke-Keating economic reforms. He's been a member of the Insiders Couch over the years, and he's actually going to be succeeded by James Chessell, who's appeared on the Insiders Couch several times as well. I'm looking forward to Q&A tomorrow night, where Stutch is going to go toe-to-toe with American progressive economist Joseph Stiglitz. It should be a ding-dong battle, and Patricia, good luck in adjudicating that one.
Shout out for the boss, but a well-deserved one. Well done, Stutch, absolutely. And yes, a shout out for watching Q&A tomorrow night. Mel.
Just going back to Peter Dutton's comments in Kalgoorlie, he's had quite a progression from railing against billions for billionaires, which was the budget reply approach when it came to subsidies for critical minerals and hydrogen. There seems to be a risk that he's escalating some previous chatter about the Liberal leader following the policy lead of the junior partner in the Nationals. So you'll remember that the Nationals were the first ones to plant their flag and say no to the Voice, that they have pulled across the Liberals when it comes to supermarket policy as well. And from the beginning, Keith Pitt was a little more moderate when it came to the response to this Future Made in Australia approach from the federal government. I think you might well see some more chatter from the junior partner over the coming week if the Liberals moderate their position, that they are once again leading the policy discussion in the coalition.
Yeah, interesting. David.
First of all, I'll back up John on the shout out to Stutch. Fantastic Fairfax journo over many years. Now, the whistleblower who revealed wrongdoing by Facebook, Frances Haugen, she's in Australia at the moment. She revealed, as a former Facebook executive, that the company knew that there was harm in what it was doing and didn't do enough to stop that harm. Now, this is on a couple of fronts, not just misinformation, which we were talking about earlier, but also the harm to children from social media. Now, Frances Haugen is in Canberra in the next couple of days. She's going to be talking to parliamentarians. It's going to be very interesting to see how that shapes the Australian debate about whether one day we have a Digital Services Act that acts on, the downside of social media.
There does seem to be momentum from many quarters. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Finally, kids can be brutally honest, even to the Prime Minister. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
Are we going to do some drawing?
I'll do green.
I've got
the Prime Minister draws
red and
rabbits.
green. I wonder why you've got red and green. You're on to me.
And then
what do you think about my drawing, Ned? Do you think it's good? Hey, what do you reckon?
That looks weird.
Can I have a look?
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.